You've been moving toward this moment for years, maybe decades. Retirement, the finish line you were told would bring freedom, rest, and peace of mind. But now that it's getting closer, something feels different than you expected, and it's hard to ignore. It's not panic, it's not even fear in the obvious sense. It's a quiet tension. A set of questions that don't fully go away. Will it be enough? Did I do this right? What happens if something changes after I stop earning? And those questions matter more than people admit, because you did what you were told. You worked, you saved, you stayed consistent. You followed the plan as it was given to you. So why does it still feel uncertain as you approach the point where it's supposed to all come together? That's the part most people don't talk about, because answering it requires looking deeper than numbers. It requires questioning whether the plan itself was ever fully understood or simply followed without being challenged. And for many, it was followed, step by step, year after year, without stopping to ask if it truly led to long-term security. And now, standing near the point where everything should feel settled, there's a realization beginning to form. Something may be missing. Not everything, but enough to matter. Because retirement is not just about reaching a number. It's about what that number actually does once you rely on it, how it holds up over time, how it responds when life doesn't follow a perfect plan. And this is where things change. Because the moment you stop earning and start relying on what you've built, your situation shifts completely. The margin for error becomes smaller. The impact of each decision becomes greater. Mistakes don't just cost money anymore. They cost time. You can't easily recover. That's why this stage requires a different kind of thinking. Not the same mindset that got you here, but one that protects, manages, and positions what you have in a way that lasts. And most people never make that shift. They continue thinking the same way they always have. They assume the system will hold. They trust that everything will work out because it always has before. And slowly, small gaps begin to appear. Not immediately, but over time. Because what worked during your working years does not always work the same way when you're no longer bringing in active income. The rules change. But no one clearly explains how. So people continue with what feels familiar. And familiarity can be dangerous. Not because it's wrong, but because it may no longer be enough. There are small decisions at this stage that don't seem important in the moment. Minor adjustments, details that feel technical, easy to ignore. But over time, those details begin to shape the outcome, quietly, consistently, until the difference becomes clear. Because the difference between those who feel secure in retirement and those who don't is rarely effort. It's awareness. It's whether they recognized what needed to change and acted on it early enough. And here's the part that matters most. This stage is not fixed. The outcome is not decided. Because how you think, how you adjust, how you respond to what's ahead can still change everything. The direction is still within your control even now, but only if you pay attention, only if you're willing to look closely at what's been assumed, what's been overlooked, and what needs to be understood before it becomes urgent. Because once you reach a certain point, reacting becomes harder, planning becomes more important, and awareness becomes everything. What you're about to hear is not meant to alarm you. It's meant to sharpen your thinking, to show you what most people miss at this stage, and what becomes possible when you finally see it clearly. Because retirement is not just an ending, it's a transition. And how you move through it will determine whether the years ahead feel secure or uncertain. So don't treat this as background noise. Treat it as a moment to pause, to reassess, to recognize where you are and where you're heading if nothing changes. Because once you see it clearly, you have a choice to continue on the same path or to adjust now and change the ending entirely. There comes a point in a man's life when the nature of his financial position changes in a way that is rarely discussed, yet deeply felt. It does not arrive suddenly, nor does it announce itself with urgency. It appears quietly, almost unnoticed, as the years of earning begin to give way to a period of reliance. And in this shift lies one of the most important transitions a man will ever experience. For many years, a man's efforts are directed toward accumulation. He works, he earns, and he builds. His actions are focused on increasing what he has, strengthening his position, and preparing for what lies ahead. There is movement, there is growth, and there is a sense that progress is being made through continued effort. During this stage, the flow of income provides both security and flexibility. Mistakes, though undesirable, can often be corrected. Adjustments can be made. Time, combined with effort, allows for recovery and improvement. The system appears forgiving, and the path forward seems clear. Yet as retirement approaches, something changes. The flow that once supported growth begins to slow, and eventually it stops. What was once being built must now begin to sustain. What was once increasing must now endure. And this shift from accumulation to dependence alters everything. It is not always understood in its full weight. For many, reaching retirement is seen as the completion of a plan, a destination, a point at which the years of effort finally give way to rest and security. The assumption is that once a certain level has been reached, the future will take care of itself. But this assumption is rarely examined. The truth is that reaching a number is not the same as understanding what that number must do. It is not enough to arrive. One must know how to remain. This is where uncertainty begins to appear, not as panic, but as awareness. A man may find himself asking questions he had not considered before. Whether what he has built will hold, whether it will respond as expected, whether it will last as long as it must. These questions do not come from weakness. They come from recognition that the conditions have changed, that what once worked may no longer function in the same way, that the margin for error is no longer what it once was. There are many who arrive at this stage believing they have done everything correctly. They followed the plan. They remained consistent. They avoided unnecessary risk. And in doing so, they reached the point they were told would bring certainty. Yet instead of certainty, they feel something else, a quiet tension. not because they failed, but because they sensed that something was never fully understood. This is not uncommon, for the system that brings a man to this point does not always teach him how to operate within it once he arrives. It prepares him to build, but not always to sustain. It emphasizes accumulation, but does not always explain continuation. And so, many find themselves entering a stage for which they were not fully prepared, not in resources, but in understanding. There are examples of individuals who reached retirement with what appeared to be sufficient means, yet found themselves uncertain in how to manage them. They had built well, but had not fully learned how to direct what they had built once it became their primary source of support. In contrast, there are those who approach this transition differently. They recognized that the stage required a new kind of thinking. They understood that the rules had changed and that their approach must change with them. Such individuals often appear calm, composed, and in control, not because they have more, but because they understand more. They do not rely upon assumptions. They examine. They do not continue blindly. They adjust. And through this, they position themselves in a way that allows their resources to support them effectively over time. Others begin to notice this difference. They see a man who is not uncertain but prepared, not reactive but deliberate. There is a steadiness in his approach that comes not from chance but from clarity. And this clarity influences how he is perceived. He is seen as someone who understands not only how to reach a position, but how to maintain it. There is an affirmation that supports this awareness. I understand not only how to build, but how to sustain and direct what I have built. This statement shifts the focus from arrival to continuation. It reinforces the idea that reaching a point is only part of the process. As this understanding deepens, the individual begins to examine his situation more closely. He considers not only what he has, but what it must do, how it must behave, how it must respond over time. He recognizes that his role has changed. He is no longer simply a builder. He is now a director. This shift in role requires a shift in thinking. For what worked in the past effort, consistency, accumulation, must now be complemented by something else: awareness, positioning, and deliberate control. There may be resistance in this realization. The mind prefers to believe that what has worked will continue to work, that no adjustment is necessary, that the system will hold because it has held before. Yet these beliefs must be examined, for they are based on conditions that no longer fully apply. The individual must ask himself whether his current understanding is sufficient for the stage he has entered, whether he is prepared not just to hold what he has, but to manage it effectively. This questioning is not a sign of doubt. It is a sign of intelligence, for it is through questioning that clarity is gained, and through clarity that direction is established. As this process continues, a shift begins to occur. The individual becomes more attentive, more deliberate, more aware of how each decision affects what lies ahead. He no longer assumes that things will simply continue. He ensures that they do. This change, though internal, becomes visible. Others see a man who is not merely present in his circumstances, but actively engaged with them. He appears thoughtful, controlled, and prepared. His actions suggest that he understands the importance of this stage. and is responding accordingly. This perception carries influence. For those who demonstrate control in uncertain stages are often regarded with respect. They are seen as individuals who are not dependent upon chance, but guided by understanding. There is a deeper realization that emerges from this process, that retirement is not an ending, it is a transition from one form of responsibility to another, from building to sustaining, from earning to directing, from movement to management. And the man who understands this does not approach it passively. He approaches it with intention. He recognizes that what lies ahead is shaped not by what he has alone, but by how he uses it. And in that recognition, he begins to take control of a stage that most simply enter, not blindly, but deliberately. There is a tendency in every man to rely upon what has brought him to his current position. This tendency is natural. It is built through repetition, reinforced by experience, and strengthened by results that once proved effective. Over time, these patterns become trusted. They feel correct, reliable, and safe to continue. Yet what is seldom considered is that a pattern is only effective within the conditions in which it was formed. When those conditions change, the pattern must change with them. The danger arises when the man continues to think in the same way even after the stage of his life has shifted. He applies the same reasoning, the same assumptions, and the same habits that once served him well without recognizing that the environment has changed. During his working years, his thinking was supported by continuous income. There was movement, replenishment, and the ability to recover from error. Decisions, even imperfect ones, could be adjusted over time. The system allowed for flexibility. But now, the foundation is different. There is no longer the same flow to correct mistakes. There is no longer the same time to recover from misalignment. And yet, many continue to operate as though nothing has changed. This is not because they lack intelligence. It is because they trust what has worked. They assume that consistency will continue to produce the same result simply because it always has before. They follow the same patterns, make the same types of decisions, and rely on the same expectations without questioning whether those expectations still apply. This creates a quiet misalignment. The actions remain the same, but the results begin to differ. At first, this difference is not obvious. The system continues to function. Nothing appears to be wrong. But over time, small gaps begin to form gaps that were not present before. The man may notice that things do not stretch as far as they once did, that decisions carry more weight than they used to, that what once felt sufficient now feels uncertain. Yet instead of adjusting his thinking, he often continues as before, because familiarity feels safe. There is comfort in repeating what is known, but comfort, when applied to changing conditions, becomes limitation. There are many examples of individuals who carried their working habits directly into retirement without modification. They continued spending in the same patterns, thinking in the same cycles, and relying on the same assumptions about how money behaves. At first, nothing seemed out of place, but over time, the structure began to weaken, not dramatically, but gradually. Enough to create concern, but not enough to clearly identify the cause. This is the effect of unchanged thinking in a changed environment. In contrast, There are those who recognize this shift early. They understand that each stage of life requires its own approach, that what was once effective must now be refined. That thinking must evolve in order to remain aligned with reality. These individuals begin to ask different questions. They do not assume that past success guarantees future stability. They examine whether their current approach matches their current position. They adjust not because something is wrong, but because something is different. This adjustment is what separates those who maintain control from those who slowly lose it. There is an affirmation that supports this shift. I adjust my thinking to match the stage I have entered. This statement introduces flexibility where there was once rigidity. It allows the individual to evolve rather than remain fixed in patterns that no longer serve him. As this awareness develops, the individual begins to observe his own thinking more closely. He notices where he assumes continuity without confirmation, where he repeats decisions without examination, where he relies on familiarity instead of understanding. These observations are not meant to create doubt. They are meant to create clarity. For once a man sees where his thinking is outdated, he gains the ability to refine it. And through refinement comes control. There is also a shift in how he approaches decisions. He no longer asks, "What have I always done?" He asks, "What is required now?" This question changes everything. It removes reliance on the past and places attention on the present. It forces alignment between action and reality rather than action and habit. Others begin to notice this shift. They see a man who is no longer operating automatically, but deliberately. He appears more thoughtful, more aware, and more responsive to his situation. There is a sense of adaptability that distinguishes him from those who remain fixed. This perception carries value. For those who adapt are seen as capable, and those who are seen as capable are often trusted with opportunity, with responsibility, and with influence. There is also a change in internal confidence. The individual no longer depends solely on what he has done before. He trusts his ability to think, to adjust, and to respond to what is required. This confidence is not based on habit, it is based on awareness, and awareness allows him to move forward with precision. It must be understood that this shift does not require abandoning everything, it requires refining what remains. The man keeps what is still effective. He adjusts what is no longer aligned, and he removes what creates limitation. Through this process, his approach becomes more suited to his current stage, more accurate, more controlled, more effective. There may be moments where the old thinking attempts to return, moments where it feels easier to continue as before. But the individual who has seen clearly cannot fully return to unconscious repetition. He recognizes the difference. And because he recognizes it, he adjusts. This adjustment, though subtle, has a powerful effect over time. It prevents the slow decline that comes from misalignment. It maintains direction where others lose it. It preserves strength where others gradually weaken. Thus, it may be said that one of the most dangerous mistakes near retirement is not what a man does, but how he thinks. For thinking determines action, and action determines outcome. The man who continues to think as he always has may find that his results no longer follow. But the man who adjusts his thinking adjusts his future. And in that adjustment, he begins to move through this stage with clarity, control, and confidence. There is a belief that quietly settles into the mind of many men as they approach the later stages of their financial life, and it appears so reasonable that it is rarely questioned. It is the belief that what has remained stable will continue to remain so, that systems which have functioned reliably in the past will hold their form indefinitely, and that consistency over time is proof of future security. This belief is not born from ignorance, but from experience. A man has seen things work, has observed patterns repeat, and has come to trust in their continuation. Yet within this trust lies a danger that is not immediately visible. Stability by its nature creates comfort. It suggests predictability, order, and control. It allows a man to proceed without constant concern, to make decisions with confidence, and to feel that his position is supported by something dependable. Over time, this comfort becomes accepted as certainty. The man no longer questions the structure around him. He assumes it will continue because it always has. But what is often overlooked is that stability is not a fixed condition. It is maintained, influenced, and subject to forces that may not always be visible. The difficulty arises when a man begins to rely upon stability without understanding what sustains it. He sees the surface, but not the foundation. He observes the outcome, but not the factors that produce it. And because he does not examine these underlying elements, he cannot recognize when they begin to change. The system appears the same, yet something within it may be shifting, slowly, quietly, without immediate effect, until one day the difference becomes noticeable. At earlier stages of life, such shifts may have little consequence. There is time to adjust, time to correct, and time to recover. But near retirement, the conditions are different. There is less flexibility, less margin for error, and less opportunity to regain what is lost. The reliance upon stability becomes greater, and therefore the risk of misunderstanding it becomes more significant. There are many individuals who have placed complete trust in what appeared stable, only to discover that stability without awareness is incomplete. They assumed that because something had worked for many years, it would continue without change. They did not consider that conditions evolve, that systems respond to forces beyond their control, and that what appears fixed may, in reality, be dynamic. This realization does not come all at once. It emerges gradually, often recognized only when something does not behave as expected. A return that was assumed to continue begins to vary. A structure that seemed reliable begins to show strain. A plan that once felt certain begins to feel less so. And in that moment, the man is faced not with failure, but with a lack of preparation. In contrast, there are those who approach stability differently. They do not reject it, nor do they blindly trust it. They seek to understand it. They examine what supports it, what influences it, and what could alter it. They do not assume continuation, they prepare for variation. This preparation does not create fear, it creates control. Such individuals are often perceived with a quiet confidence. They do not react with urgency when conditions change, because they have already considered the possibility. They do not appear unsettled, because their understanding extends beyond the surface. Others see in them a sense of steadiness that is not dependent on circumstance, but on awareness. There is an affirmation that strengthens this mindset. I do not assume stability, I understand and prepare for its limits. This statement introduces depth into what was once taken at face value. It shifts the individual from passive reliance to active comprehension, from assumption to examination. As this way of thinking develops, the individual begins to look more closely at what he once accepted without question. He considers how his resources behave under different conditions, how they respond to change, and what factors influence their performance over time. He no longer sees stability as a guarantee. He sees it as a condition that must be understood. This awareness produces a different kind of decision-making. The individual does not base his actions solely on what has happened before. He considers what could happen, what might change, and how he will respond if it does. This does not lead to hesitation, it leads to preparation. Others begin to notice this difference. They see a man who is not easily unsettled, not because he avoids change, but because he anticipates it. He appears composed, deliberate, and thoughtful in his approach. This perception enhances his position, as those who understand complexity are often trusted more than those who rely on simplicity. There is also a change in how the individual experiences his own situation. He feels less dependent on external conditions and more capable of responding to them. This reduces uncertainty, not by eliminating it, but by placing it within a framework of understanding. It must be understood that stability, when properly managed, is valuable. It provides structure, continuity, and support. But when misunderstood, it creates vulnerability. The man who relies upon it without examination may find himself unprepared when conditions shift. The man who understands it is able to adapt, to adjust, and to maintain his direction. There are examples of individuals who, even in uncertain conditions, maintained their position, not because they were protected from change, but because they were prepared for it. They had examined what they relied upon, understood its limits, and positioned themselves accordingly. When change occurred, they did not react with confusion. They responded with clarity. This is the difference, not in what they had, but in how they understood it. Thus, the hidden risk is not stability itself, but the assumption that stability requires no attention. The man who recognizes this does not abandon what is steady. He strengthens it through understanding. He reinforces it through awareness. And he prepares for its limits rather than ignoring them. And in doing so, he transforms stability from something he depends upon into something he directs. There is a tendency, particularly at this stage of life, to give greater attention to large decisions while overlooking the smaller ones, believing that only significant actions produce meaningful results. This belief appears logical, for large movements are easier to recognize, easier to measure, and easier to associate with change. Yet it is often the smaller decisions, repeated consistently over time, that shape a man's true financial condition in the years that follow. During earlier periods of life, small inefficiencies may have had little lasting consequence. There was time to recover, income to compensate, and flexibility to adjust. A minor misstep could be corrected without significant impact, and the overall direction remained largely unaffected. This created the impression that small decisions were of little importance, that they could be made without careful consideration, and that their effect would remain limited. But as retirement approaches, the conditions change. The margin for error becomes narrower, the ability to replace what is lost becomes more limited, and the cumulative effect of repeated actions becomes more pronounced. What was once insignificant begins to carry weight, not because it has changed in nature, but because the context in which it operates has changed. A small decision, when made once, may seem harmless, but when made repeatedly, it forms a pattern. And patterns, over time, produce outcomes that are far greater than the individual actions that created them. This is the nature of accumulation, not only of what is built, but of what is lost. Many men do not recognize this shift immediately. They continue to make decisions as they always have, giving little attention to details that do not appear urgent. They allow small inefficiencies to persist, small expenses to pass without examination, and small adjustments to be delayed. Each decision in isolation seems unimportant, yet together they begin to shape the overall result. This shaping is gradual. It does not announce itself with sudden change, but reveals itself over time. A man may notice that his resources do not extend as far as expected, that his position feels slightly more constrained than before, or that his sense of security has begun to diminish without a clear cause. These are not the result of a single error, but of many small decisions acting together. There are examples of individuals who maintained what appeared to be careful financial conduct, yet failed to examine the details of their actions. They focused on larger structures, believing them to be sufficient, while overlooking the smaller elements that influence their outcome. Over time, these overlooked elements accumulated, creating a difference that could no longer be ignored. In contrast, there are those who understand the importance of precision at this stage. They recognize that every decision, no matter how small, contributes to the whole. They do not dismiss details as insignificant.